Alright, so welcome back, and this is going to be part 2 of John's KRC-99 True Vintage Kenwood Car Stereo. If you missed part 1, basically in that video we found out that the unit will produce audio, both left and right channels. We used a homemade 8-pin DIN connector to feed the radio over into the mixer. And they confirmed the equalizer works as well as the tuner. Basically, the radio was sold in the Asian market, so it's locked to their frequency. I think it's around 76.1 up to 88 or 89, somewhere in that neighborhood. And so basically what we did is we used a small FM stereo transmitter to get a signal from the laptop into the tuner module and confirm we do have a stereo signal for that, and that is working. So then it was on to the task of the cassette mechanism. So the last part of that video, we pulled the cassette mechanism out of it, found out both of the belts had basically turned to goo, which is what we anticipated. And so now I'm in the process, midway, of taking care of the mechanism of this. Went ahead and pulled the real motor assembly out of this. And basically we have two small motors here. One that is for the pendulum idler, it swings between the take up and supply reel. And the other one is for head engagement. So we're going to service those, a little bit of lubrication, and make sure that all of these gears are moving correctly. Make sure the mode switches are clean. There's two mode switches on this assembly that's going to need to be taken care of. So we won't know anything until we get it all back together and partially assembled so we can even try it. So that's going to be the primary focus of the video this time, see if we can get this back together and get a tape working in it. The secondary thing is this auxiliary input for this radio. The auxiliary input, from the data I was able to find, owner's manual, basically says this is for a Kenwood CD changer that would have been compatible with this radio. And for whatever particular reason, all I was seeing is audio feed on the rear channels, not the front channels. So I'm not even sure, there's no button on the front of the radio that says CD or it says auxiliary, so I'm not even sure how you access it to turn it on and get it to work. So that's another thing we'll have to look into. But our primary focus in this video will be on the cassette mechanism. So we'll pick the video up with me midway in that process. So as we come in this time, let's check out a little bit of Iron Maiden's 2000 release, Brave New World. This would have been the album Bruce came back, as well as Adrian Smith. So let's check out a little bit of my favorite track from this, called The Thin Line Between Love and Hate, and we'll pick back up on the Kenwood. All right, let's go ahead and pick back up. This portion of the service is already in progress. I started on this already. The only thing I've done to it is I took off both reels and oiled the spindles that these sit on, because when you spin them, you could hear noise, like there was some kind of resistance there. I'll show you how easy it is to get this off. You're gonna press down. Let's see if I can zoom you in a little bit here, maybe. Have to bear with me on the camera angle here. You push down on this. This is spring loaded. You'll want to hang on to it while you're pressing on it. I just use the tip of an X-Acto knife. Go ahead and go in, and you can get that C-clip off. Don't let go, and then nice and easy, bring the whole thing up, including the spring. Set that off to the side right there so you don't lose your clip. And when you lift this off, of course, it has a mirrored, staggered mirror image on it that reacts with the photodiode on the main board. And when you spin that, it should spin just that free and just that quiet. So that's pretty much how you do it. And of course, you just reverse the process when you're going to put it back together. One thing I am going to do is I'm going to kind of squeeze my C-clip kind of into itself a little bit, just so it's got a little better bite when I get ready to put it back on there. We'll just use a pair of hemostats for that. This is another one where you don't want to let go. Keep your fingers in between it. There we go. Otherwise, it'll go flying across the room. And of course, there's one little washer here. I always seem to have my hand on the wrong thing that I'm looking for. And once you have it under spring load, if you let go of it, hub, spring, clip, and washer will go flying across the room. So you definitely want to hang on to that. And the way I like to do it is just get my C-clip kind of into place. And once I got it into place like that right there, again, not letting go of anything, and then get it into position, and there you go. I did the same thing to the one on the other side as I did here, and those are working real good now. And I always double check just to make sure I got it, and it looks fine, so there shouldn't be any issue there. So in this assembly here, we've got two small motors. One of these motors is responsible for driving this mode switch and the pendulum idler that moves between the take-up and supply reel. This motor here is responsible for driving this cam gear with a metal rotary hub on it that drives the head assembly in and out. These two motors are notorious for getting stuck over time, especially with no usage. So the first thing we're going to do, I've already taken off the gear that goes right here in this position. It's right here. As you can see, it's got some contact points on it that come into contact with the circuit board. Copper traces here, basically a mode switch. But the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take some contact cleaner and put it in the edge of these motors and exercise them a little bit. May need to zoom you out for that. And the best I can tell you is that you'll be able to get the tip of a straw down into the edge of this, but that's probably about it. I'm not going to take these motors apart. They do work, but I'm not going to take them apart and attempt anything crazy unless one of them wasn't working at all. So let's get a rag here. And I'm just using a little of my MG Chemical Super Contact Cleaner. And you'll see it running out the back side. And then we're going to do the exact same thing on the other side. Paying close attention to these switches and things like this. You don't want to rip one of these very frail, tiny connectors off. That should be good. Now we're going to inject a little voltage in there. I'm not sure what the deck runs for voltage to these motors, but I'm using about 3 volts. And that seems to be more than enough to get them moving. Okay. And we're just going to sub that in with the power supply. This will be the first motor. Looking for that gear right there to start rotating. And then reverse as well. And there isn't any, other than these motors, there isn't any electronics that I'm shooting voltage into here. The solenoid has its own 2 separate contacts over on the edge of the ribbon cable. So we're shooting voltage directly into the motor and the motor alone, nothing else. And that seems to be good. So we'll leave that. Now let's try the other one. If you watch that video from the other Kenwood that I done, when I first got it back together, nothing was still happening when I got the belts in it. And that's when I discovered these motors were stuck and they weren't moving. And that seems to be just fine there as well. Moving nice and freely. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to clean that mode switch, the pads, and the switch itself. Taking a Q-tip, saturating it with some of that super contact cleaner, and we'll use that on the board here. And you can see that we got a little residue there. Now we'll use the other side and clean the actual rotary gear. There's some contact points on it. Now, these didn't look too bad, honestly. Now, what you want to do here, you definitely want to pay attention to how this metal is kind of infused into this plastic. It's melted by 2 little pieces right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab onto it over here on this side, and I'm just going to bend these up. Just slightly bend these up. So that way when I put it back on the board, we know it's going to make a good connection. And that should be about it. And I'm going to put this gear facing this direction right here. All right, and I'll find the clip for that. First, I got to wipe my hand off. I have some more of that black goo. That must have came off a towel that I was using. Let me see if I can wipe that up off of my book here. Doesn't take much to get that stuff everywhere. Okay. Now I have a retaining clip for that somewhere in here. All right, give me a moment to locate that and I'll pick back up with you. All right, let's go ahead and pick back up. I was able to find the missing clip. Went ahead and got that mode switch gear installed. Went ahead and installed the idler as well. removed the second gear with the switch in it, cleaned that up, and reinstalled it. Basically the same principle. The only difference is you'll have to take this joining gear off in order to get this one out. And so when I put the idler back in, there was a reason that I had this gear, the raised section of this gear, pointing towards the out direction. And that's because when you put this idler back on, and it's really easy to do it, I'll show you here. Basically, you got a little clip that's really easy to take off and put on, and there's a post that comes through the body, and then the clip just slips over it like a C-clip. But these two arms here, I'll see if I can get you in, show you what I'm talking about. These two arms here go on the outside of that raised portion of this gear and just basically direct it over to the take-up or supply reel, whichever way you're going, forward or reverse. We'll shoot a little voltage into it and kind of simulate what I'm talking about here. So it makes its way over to this reel, and as the capstan motor drives the idler, it turns the reel. And of course, if you want to go the opposite way, you just flip the voltage around, and it goes that direction. Pretty simple. And when we're putting this back in, we're just going to leave it in the center position. I'm not sure what the tape deck considers to be neutral. I don't know if it's in the middle or if it favors one side to the other, so we're just going to leave it that way. And in this gear here, we're going to leave pointing the opposite way. And we're going to put it right back in here. And it's very simple to do it. There isn't much to lining this up. There's two screws here. Two screw holes. Basically line this up. And it'll click into place. And then you'll know you have it. Let me see if I can zoom you in here. Get you in here to see what I'm talking about. The post of this gear is down inside this rounded portion of this lever right here. And I don't think you can see it through here, but it just goes right down inside there. You can get a good look at it from this angle. And then you just put your two screws in, and that is, the heads are in the retracted position at this point, I believe. So that's pretty much it. Two screws, and then I'll have to mount back the switches. There's a few screws holding these in place, so I'll get all that taken care of. I'm going to go ahead and get all of this put back together. I went ahead and took the capstans out and got all those cleaned up. I was able to get the motor pulley clean. And that took a long time because that goo was down in all of the grooves of this. And so it took a while to clean that up. And then on these, on the capstans, got to be a little careful here because we've got a plastic gear. So we can't put anything too abrasive all over this thing. So it took a while to get that cleaned up. And you'll want to make sure that it's not just clean in the walls, but down deep in that groove. You'll have to get all of that goo out of there. And so I got them both cleaned up. They both look pretty good. And the plastic gear over here was fun to do because, of course, it's plastic. So didn't use anything abrasive there. Just good old soap and water. I put a bag over the gear or underneath it, plastic bag to keep, soap and water from getting all over everything else. So we've got enough of it done now to where I think I can go ahead and start putting it back together, and we'll stick it in the radio and we'll see what happens. So I'm going to go ahead and start that process, and I'll bring you back once I have it installed and we can go a little further. So give me a moment for that. All right, real quick, let's come back in and just kind of review everything we've done to this. Went ahead and got everything back together now, including the new belts installed. Everything's looking pretty good. You'll notice that on the two capstans, there's one with kind of a gold hub on it and one with kind of a dark black looking hub. The way that these go in is the gold one, originally before I took anything apart, was the one closest to the motor. So of course I put them back the exact way that I found them. And if we take a look at this, now that we've got it all back together, you'll see the leaf switches here are in their correct position. There's a screw in each one of them on the side that kind of holds it into the frame, a tiny screw. And of course I was paying attention and putting these screws in compartments to where I would know where they go. And then there's two leads coming out here that runs underneath the cable back over to another switch, which might be a little difficult to see because the capstan's in now. And of course you'll want to pay attention to how all these switches come out and what position they're in. There's a small, I think I called it a solenoid, basically an electric magnet type of deal here. It has a small screw in it as well. Make sure that's lined up. And then of course the connector comes out to the end, and there's a small cable coming off of it that runs here, and there's a switch on the loading assembly. And of course that has its own particular position to be in. The motor goes in, speed control at the top, connector harness part at the bottom. And these pressure rollers, well, we're not going to get new ones, so I did the best that I could as far as getting them cleaned up. They are free moving, but honestly, as with all car stereos from this time frame, you know, the best you can do with these pressure rollers is not much. Just maybe clean them slightly with a little bit of rubber revitalizer and hope for the best. As for the head assembly, I don't know if we can get a shot of that down through here. Probably not, but it looks pretty clean. All cleaned it all up, polished it up with a little Windex. Got the tape residue off of it. When you get ready to put the capstans back in, get ready for a little bit of a challenge there. See if I can get you zoomed in here. Of course, each one of these has a very small washer and a very small C-clip, so it'll take a little patience to get these put back in. And I would do it kind of in a contained environment. Take a towel and wrap it over the top and wrap it over the underneath. That way if you miss and that thing goes flying, it'll be contained in an area where you can find it. So other than that, belts look good. Everything's moving nice and free. Put the cover back on this. A couple other observations that I've made. Zoom you back out here. We were talking about that preamp board and the caps on it. I ran all these old Elna caps with my ESR meter. None of them qualifies in the bad category. They're kind of just marginal, so they're still working, but not officially bad yet. So I don't think we're going to mess with any of this. We're going to leave it alone. If we find out we have some kind of a problem later, then we might readdress it. But officially, according to the ESR meter, they're not actually bad. But that doesn't mean that I wouldn't recommend at some point down the road maybe changing them. But at this point, they are still checking good with the ESR meter. A few other things here that I've noticed. Did the same thing with these, kind of ran some of these caps too, and they all check about the same way that the ones over here check that are of the same value. Just kind of looking at all of this and just the way that all of this is laid out and how much stuff they managed to get in this cabinet in such a small space. It is truly just a feat of engineering for back in those days anyway. These small, round, surface mount resistors. Nowadays, these would be about half the size they are here in this package. All the small diodes. Here's the two photosensors. One's shooting a beam up. It gets reflected back off of that reel and then, sent back down to the receiver portion of it. That lets the machine know the tape is moving. Yeah, definitely a lot going on here. I mean, I definitely see the money that this would have cost back in the day. There was a lot that went into this. I noticed there's a small piezo microphone element right here, and I assume that's for the auto volume, to adjust the auto volume. I can't see any other reason that that would be there. Again, don't have an owner's manual, official owner's manual for this particular model. But I should have looked into the owner's manual I did find. That model probably has the same feature. I wasn't looking for that. I was looking for the hookup diagrams for that CD player. As it turns out, that CD player that you use through the auxiliary of this, not a CD changer. It's an exact 1 DIN size single CD player, which apparently does have basically the same set of functions on it that this does. It has volume control, 2 sets of preamp outs. So that's probably how they're using the auxiliary input as the rear for the CD player, and the CD player itself provides the front output. So basically like having 2 individual components, one sharing the amplifier that the radio shares and the other one having a separate amplifier, I guess is how this is supposed to work. So anyway, I think at this point, let's go ahead and get the cassette mechanism put back in it. We won't know anything until I get all this hooked up. I'm going to put as little back together as I can in order to try it, and we'll see if it'll play a tape. So give me a few minutes for that, and I'll pick back up with you and let you know what I found out. All right, let's go ahead and pick back up. Went ahead and got the cassette mechanism put back in the unit, and we'll get to testing that in just a moment, but a couple things we probably should take a look at. I did find a service manual online. I had to buy it for a KRC-99, and I found a free owner's manual, so we're going to look at that first. And here what they're showing is the optional CD player, a KRC-9, basically laid out the way the cassette deck is. We got a DC to DC converter, and here's where it gets a little funny for me. We got the front preamp out coming down into a cable, assuming it would be going to an amplifier. We have the rear coming over here, and that's where the drawing gets cut off. And I've looked at several versions of this manual, and every one of them seem to have this cutoff drawing right here. But you can see it coming down, getting ready to go into the auxiliary of the preamp connections for the cassette deck. We have front preamp out, rear preamp out, and of course right next to that would be the auxiliary. So they're kind of showing, unless there's something with the way that this drawing is, they're kind of showing that the rear output of the CD player here is going to go into the auxiliary, and the front will come down and possibly go to the amplifier. But yet, as the diagram continues on, it shows the front output, the rear output going to separate amplifiers. So I'm not sure what they're planning on doing with this, unless there's 2 inputs. If you're using a Kenwood amplifier, maybe there's 2 inputs on a particular amplifier they're suggesting that you use here, or implying that you might use, so I'm not real sure. So that's where my whole thing with the CD player connecting into this is kind of going off the rails a little bit. So let's take a look at the service manual for this. And all we're really wanting to pay attention to is that CD input. And of course we have the left, the right, and the ground. Those are on pins 2, 4, and 1. But what the big thing is pin 3 and pin 7. They have these labeled PC and C plus B. And I would imagine one of these lines is going to be the control line that would come from that CD player, turning on the preamp in the cassette head unit, allowing that signal to pass through. But exactly what that is, I don't know. Now, of course, on the front of this radio, you got your choices of 3 things you can do here: EQ, tuner, or tape. There is no button for CD. So it would have to be the CD player being turned on when the radio is in an off state, such as this right here. One of those lines in that DIN connection would trigger this to turn back on in just a preamp only state, to where you could get, you know, the sound to feed from the CD player into this radio and back out to the amplifier. So not real sure how that goes. I know for a fact that if you feed in, I've already attempted to feed in the right and left signal to this, and just stationary, it doesn't do anything. I have the radio functions turned off right here. The ignition switch is still on, or we're simulating that because both lines are receiving 12 volts. The constant 12 and the switch 12 are receiving 12 volts, but neither function is active right now. But yet if you input a signal into right or into left, it doesn't do anything. So one of those lines has to trigger it to turn on. But if that's triggered with a high voltage or a low voltage, I'm not real sure. Looking through the schematic there, I can't really get a good idea for which one, you know, for what you would do to get it to trigger on. So I think we're going to leave that as is. John already sent me a piece of equipment he found, an FM modulator, way better than the one that I'm using here, in order to get the signal from whatever device he wants to use through the tuner. Obviously the tuner, with its limited band being from the Asian market, he's not going to be able to use it anyway. So I'm going to go ahead and use that piece of equipment in order to get his signal into the radio. So let's go ahead and let me get this computer closed up, and we'll go ahead and pick back up real quick and we'll demo the tuner, and I'll show you what I know about the tape deck now that we've got that all back installed. So give me a second for that. All right, as we come back in, we'll go ahead and run through testing the tuner portion of this again now that we have everything back together, or partially back together I should say. I've got a few screws in the tape mechanism. The shielding with the buzzer element is not attached, but we can see our tuner is still working here. We'll turn it up in the mixer a little bit. Had that coming in through our little stereo transmitter. And here's what we get with the tape. The way this operates, you can push the tape partially in, then from that point, if you push the tape button, tape gets sucked into the machine, and here we go. I'll settle for life. Now, of course, you're hearing this with some ground noise in it. That's because we don't have the shield back on here. It does have a partition that goes behind the head amp, and it will clean up all that noise, but we didn't want to put it all back together until we knew that we had it working, and everything does seem to be working as it's supposed to. In the process of getting that all put back together, I went ahead and did a speed alignment on this, tweaked it out beautifully, no problem whatsoever, and everything seems to be working. Let's take a look at the mechanism in action here. Of course, we're moving in the forward direction from this vantage point. Let's take it into the reverse direction. Head basically just retracts, other pressure roller engages, and away we go. So it's doing its thing, and our tape advance, that does work. I tried all of that. It's doing what it's supposed to be doing. So I think that from this point, I want to go ahead and get the shielding and everything back on it, and we're going to get ready to do a final play test on this. I don't see anything that would prevent us from getting it back together at this point. Everything seems to be working smoothly as it's supposed to. If we want to do fast forward and rewind, and then rewind, and then back to play if we want. So everything seems to be doing what it's supposed to do. So I think at this point, let's go ahead and get the whole thing reassembled, all the shielding on it, the top cover on it, and we'll go ahead and do a final play test on this one. Everything seems to be working the way it's supposed to at this point. So give me a moment for that, and we'll come back in. All right, so as we come back in one final time, having a look at this Kenwood KRC-99 true vintage car stereo. As always, I want to thank you guys very much. I appreciate you checking out the video this time, as well as all the videos on the channel. Thanks to John, appreciate you sending this one up here to me to take a look at for you. After everything is said and done, I feel very fortunate that we were able to get the cassette deck in this working. The pressure rollers are not in the best shape in the world, but it does seem like everything is moving the way it's supposed to, and the tape is playing with very little wow and flutter that I could hear anyway. So in these situations where you're dealing with something 40 plus years old, there is no new parts, so we basically just have to work with what we have. And in this particular case, we got away with it, I guess you would say. So if you have one of these radios, the best advice I can give anyone is take your time taking it apart. Be very careful with all those very tiny, frail ribbon connectors, and you'll find yourself in the cassette section doing basically what I did, which was, taking care of the belts, nice and gooed up. You want to do a lot of cleaning prior to putting those new belts in, and take that reel assembly out, service that basically the same way I did, just putting a little contact cleaner in the motors and making sure the mode switches are clean. And there's a lot of things that I did to this that I wasn't able to show in the video. One of the things was I cleaned up all those leaf switches that are a part of that reel assembly. So as we make our way out of this video, we're going to listen to a little bit of one of my favorite bands, Blue Oyster Cult. Play that band a lot on my channel. And we're checking out their very first album. I made a copy of it on an old vintage Maxell tape, and that's what's in the player right now. So let's go ahead and fast forward this. We got the tape advance turned on. Let's go ahead and fast forward this to the next track, and we'll listen to Then Came the Last Days of May.
Traffic light, now and then a truck, and I hadn't seen a cop around all day.